Okay, welcome to the Laffer Curve, a very controversial area of economics. The Laffer Curve is loved by the right and perhaps of concern to those on the left. Let's look at this now. Professor Laffer drew this curve on the back of a napkin in a restaurant in the 70s to illustrate his point that high rates of tax actually lead to less tax revenue from the economy for the government. Let's look at why that might happen. If we've got tax rate on the bottom, at 0%, the government is going to get 0% tax revenue. So you don't tax economic activity, you won't get any tax revenue, of course. At 100%, the tax will create such a disincentive effect there will not be economic activity, and therefore there'll be zero tax revenue. And we have a range of options in between following this curve. So the idea is, if we want to maximise tax revenue, we keep on increasing the tax rate until we get to point X. Okay. The problem is that no one really knows where point X is for a specific economy at a specific point in time. But if we just look at what happens, if we keep on increasing the tax rate, we get more and more tax revenue, but beyond point X, the taxes are having such a disincentive effect that you actually raise less tax revenue. And so what Professor Laffer and many supply-side economists suggest, that if you reduce the top rate, or you reduce the average tax take, say from point A to point B. Okay, so we've got point A here at a very high rate, say 90%, and reduce it to say 50%. Then what happens? We actually get more tax revenue. And so what governments in the 80s and 90s have done is followed Professor Laffer's advice and reduced the top rate of tax in order to stimulate the economy and obviously obtain more tax revenue. But whether that happened in practice is debatable, and we'll come to that. Even before you get to point X, at this point here, we're having a significantly disincentive effect on the economy because the Laffer curve is near vertical here. You could look at the elasticity if you want and do differentiation if you really wanted to, but the key point is that as you go here, we start at 0 and the tax rate goes up. We get lots more tax revenue, but even at this point here, the line is becoming quite shallow, isn't it? And as we go, say, from 40 to 50%, do we get that much extra tax revenue? Okay, we only get a little more because the taxes are having such a disincentive effect on economic activity. And the reason why this takes place is, first of all, it'll reduce the tax base. There'll be less economic activity. There'll be less economic growth because of the disincentive effect of having to pay high taxes. And we're usually referring to income tax, corporation tax, and capital gains tax. And this is not necessarily the case, of course, with indirect taxes such as VAT. So it'll reduce economic growth, it'll lower employment. Why work more hours when you're paying a very high rate of marginal tax on the hours that you work? It'll lead to tax avoidance, so people will legitimately use the law. They lose accountants that are smart and smart lawyers to try and avoid tax legitimately, or there'll be downright illegal tax evasion, or there'll be a brain drain. People will simply move to another country. So an instance might be Gérard Depardieu, famous French actor, who threatened to leave France as a result of Hollande's 75% income tax, which took place after 2012. The tax has since elapsed, perhaps because of the Laffer curve. So these disincentive effects perhaps reduce economic growth, okay? And they're based on the idea of the substitution effect. The substitution effect is that if you have to pay a very high marginal rate of tax, it's worthwhile taking more leisure and reducing the working hours that you work, and therefore reducing labour activity. because of that disincentive effect. Okay. Well, of course, not everyone can vary the number of hours that they work. However, we must look at this a little critically. The key thing is also the income effect, but some households have to achieve a certain level of income, and therefore they have to ensure that they have basic needs met, such as paying utility bills, food bills, accommodation bills. And therefore, if you actually increase the income tax on that group of people, often poorer people, they might actually have to work harder and have another part-time job or something like that to make ends meet. And that's the income effect. So the problem is that possibly the substitution effect is dominant for the rich, that can move to a different country, that can choose how many hours they work, whereas the income effect might be more dominant for people lower down the income spectrum. However, another problem is why do people work? People don't just work for the cash nexus of the money they receive. You know, I work because I love what I do. People work for status. People work, partly myself, because of vocational reasons, because they believe in what they do. Okay, so it's not as straightforward as Professor Laffer would have you think. And then people also work, a key area to look at is economic studies, or econometric studies as we call them. There's an OECD study of 18 countries that shows no correlation between economic growth and changes to the top rate of tax. So countries where the top rate of tax has fallen are no different in terms of their growth rate to ones where the top rate of tax has remained the same. And this is borne out by Reagan. Reaganomics is the idea of very much influenced by Professor Laffer. He reduced the top rate of tax from 70% to 31% in the 1980s in the United States. Did tax revenue increase? No, it didn't. As a proportion of GDP, it fell by around 1%. So where this point is in any one country is difficult to work out. A Laffer Curve effect, for some economists, occurs at point X is around 70% tax rate, whilst other supply-side market-orientated economists argue it's more like 30-40%. Okay? So there's a lot of debate about where this point actually lies. And so this remains a controversial area. So thank you for watching.